Today we're going to talk about future narratives. So when we're looking at internet infrastructure, many of us think of the internet as in the cloud, and we see the internet as neutral because technology in itself can be neutral, but it's really about how it is used. So today I'm going to introduce you to competing narratives of internet infrastructure. And how I'm going to do that, I'm going to present two different narratives, starting from the 1700s and even to today. So we're going to look at undersea cables mainly. And I am from Zambia, and I'm going to bring it to you from an African context, but also bring it to you from the perspective of the West as well. So these are the competing narratives I'll be talking about. But most importantly, last week was Africa Liberation Week. So that was the celebration of the continent's freedom from colonial powers. And so today we're going to see, is that really the true reality, or is the digital sphere bringing a new type of colonialism? There we have a message. So the Berlin Conference happened or ended 140 years ago in February. So Berlin is very important for the colonial history of the African continent. So 140 years ago, they decided we're going to divide the continent among Western powers. And so really, the world we're seeing today was a vision created over a century ago. But even before that, there was something called the Atlantic Telegraph. It happened right after the slave trade was no longer profitable. So they were thinking of new ways of getting resources from the former slave routes. And now they brought the Atlantic Telegraph. In the image that you saw at first, we saw that the Father Neptune was blessing Uncle Sam and Britannica and saying, may the Atlantic be a bond between these two nations to bring civilization, religion, and liberty throughout the world. So we already see that the Atlantic Telegraph is a tool being used by colonial leaders to monitor their new colonies. And ultimately, this is what is being used today. So we see now the Industrial Revolution was what brought the world as we know today. Labor changed and how we relate to each other changed. And now we're in the fourth Industrial Revolution. But what we saw at that time was a narrative talking about tabula rasa. Tabula rasa is called empty slate. So when the colonialists came, they saw that, well, this is an empty continent full of land, full of nature. They saw it as tabula rasa. But really, because they were not in the same cosmology as the African states, they did not see that these spaces were actually not empty. Trees were seen as divine. Spirits were also seen as divine and as existing. So their perspective was that everything was for the taking. And what happened is they took from the soil, the African soil, and then transformed it into these tools of extraction. But ultimately, they were invading these sacred spaces from our land. And we're seeing the same narrative with undersea cables, where they're saying the digital divide is happening in our continent, in the African continent. And so we're coming to bring to you tools for civilization. We're coming to bring you onto the internet to bridge the divide. But ultimately, it's now for the extraction of data and for building their own artificial intelligence, which also requires a lot of mineral resources that are taken from the same lands. So that we see is a narrative that is competing from that time to now. And so the Atlantic Telegraph is the predecessor of undersea cables that we use today. And this was called the eighth wonder of the world. And the narratives here was of conquest, where they said, now we have conquered the seas, so we now have the divine right to conquer the lands. And we now start to see that divine beings or cosmological beings are being used as symbolic to say we have a right or we have the manifest destiny to overcome these lands and to take from them. The Atlantic telegraph was really a tool that was being used for extraction. And here we see a colonialist, Cecil Rhodes, and we see how he was using minerals from the African continent for their colonial extraction and expansion. And this was used to build railroads and telegraph lines. So on the African continent, his powers really was to dominate local communities so that they can expand. And we also saw there was a wealthy businessman, John Pender, who was known as the father of the telegraphs. And what he used to build these telegraphs was wealth coming from cotton, which was taken by slaves. So the slave trade and also telegraphs and undersea cables really were used from minerals from the African continent. And so we start to see the relationship now between the narratives of we're going to give you civilization or enlightenment, and also the narrative of we're going to take from you so that we build these infrastructures. So this is a speech by Cecil Rhodes. And when you read this speech, we see very clearly the narrative of white supremacy. We also see very clearly the narrative of being entitled to the land and to the people. And this narrative is where Cecil Rhodes says that the natives have to be put in their proper position. So it's also putting a very Western hierarchy on the local peoples, and that they want to use instruments such as war and pestilence to control the local population so that they can continue to grow their own empire. So it's very clear the rhetoric around the telegraph lines and the Atlantic cables that these were used to improve the empire's state and also help with their industrialization and innovation. So we're seeing that technology in this way is used as a way of domination at that time. And here we're looking at a picture from 1944. We're seeing apartheid South Africa, and we're seeing Black laborers pulling undersea cables onto South Africa. So we see the relationship between labor and Black bodies being used to advance technological innovations. Nowadays, we may not necessarily see it in the same way, but when you go to social media, you start to see who is contributing more of their data, who's contributing more on trends that make these big tech companies build their artificial intelligence. And the rhetoric and the narratives start from way back. Even when Nikola Tesla was thinking of the future of wireless, it was also from the perspective of domination and talking about uncivilized countries and also less accessible regions. So when we also think about it from our own perspective, when we start talking about places that are underserved, we still use the same rhetoric of saying, oh, they're not developed. And we also use the same rhetoric of they're not accessible. So we see that we are also adopting the same language and also advancing the colonial dream. I want to show you this map from the year 1730. This is a map of the telegraph surrounding the African continent. So we see that infrastructure was already used centuries ago, just after the slave trade, as a new form of domination for the colonies. And we see in this map before the Berlin Conference that Africa does not have country states the way it was after the Berlin Conference. So we see that the exploitation or the dream for domination started way before. And this is also being replicated today. We see here on the furthest right, this is the longest undersea cable in the world today, 2025, Codes to Africa. Meta and their consortium has built the longest undersea cable in the world, and it mirrors this 1730 map that showed telegraph cables. So we see that big tech's innovations are not necessarily innovative in the way that they're saying, because they're simply continuing the past colonial infrastructure and building on top of it. And this is Google's undersea cable in West Africa. And we see it covers the entire West Africa. It's called Equiano. Equiano was an abolitionist who was forcibly taken as a slave from Benin. And we see that the same routes that Equiano traveled is now the undersea cable name for Google. And here we also see parallel, the West Africa Telegraph Company had the same thing in the 1800s, similar map. And more than that, we also start to see that there is more. And here we're seeing inside is a new fiber optic cable that Google is building called Umoja, or Togetherness. And on the furthest right, on the furthest left, rather, we see that that's Africa's critical mineral belt. So we're seeing that these big tech companies are very strategic in where they're building and how they're building. And that is a question of how do they get this power to do this? Who do they ask for permission? And where do they take their profits? And those are all the questions that arise. But generally, they're doing this through a narrative saying we're going to bridge the digital divide, we're going to connect the unconnected. So these narratives makes them look like the savior, but when in actuality, they are also there for the taking. So it's really now continues even to this day. This is an artwork that I did showing the undersea cables surrounding the African continent. And what you see at the right is a message from the United States Congress in 2024. And they're saying they want to build their own transatlantic undersea fiber optic cable. So now the empire sees that they're not able to use Meta's or Google's undersea cables, so they want to build it themselves around the African continent. And there's all these narratives of give us your minerals to build these systems, and we're going to give you peace. With the United States giving that option to Congo DR and also giving that option to Ukraine. And we're also seeing the same rhetoric being replicated. Give us your minerals and we'll give you peace. So it's the same narrative, though it's seemingly a future narrative, it's really the past being replicated into the future. So yeah, the dream continues. Now we're looking at the future narratives. We have Meta. Meta saw that they could build the longest undersea cable in the world. Now they're investing 10 billion to build the world's longest undersea cable surrounding the globe. So they're like, why stop at Africa? We're going to take over the world. And then we also see that Elon Musk has over 60% of active satellites active today. And these satellites are releasing radiation into space. They're not even very well made because they're dropping every single day. 3 satellites are being decommissioned. In January, we saw 120 of Starlink satellites having to be decommissioned. And when they're decommissioned, they're thrown down to space, and you think you're looking at a shooting star. Maybe you make a wish, but really you're wishing on Starlink's failing satellite. And we're seeing Stargate. They want to build the largest AI infrastructure. And a lot of these big companies want to build, to fuel their data centers with nuclear energy. So we're seeing them moving a lot into different aspects of our lives. So not only are they monopolizing the application layer of the internet, now they want to monopolize infrastructure that is really rooted and physical. So my project as an artist is really to also get and collect different narratives from other parts of the world, from the global south. And in my work, I've been collecting different narratives about the future. And what I found is that there are already existing competing narratives. But what is happening is that the media is overwhelmingly pushing the narrative of big tech and talking about how it's futuristic, when really it's not. It's just replicating what's already been done in the past. And so in the narratives that I've been collecting from other parts of the world, it looks at community ownership. It looks at how we can own what we use, but also most importantly, how we can allow things like infrastructure to have their own lifespan. Like we all live today, we grow up, we die, and then we transition into the spirit world. And so everything has a lifespan. But what we're seeing with the alternative narratives is that they want things to live forever. So this is a QR code where you can find my work on Afrogrids and where I share more about this type of work. And when you read about it, I share future alternatives and different work that's being done. And there's something that I call the cosmology of internet infrastructure that looks at it from where we were in the past and present, how we're transitioning with green technology, and where we're going into the future. Ultimately, we ask the question, do we want Google here? And how long can they stay? How can we shape our future in a way that we can take ownership of our infrastructure? But ultimately, I also want you to go away with this. Berlin was very central in shaping the future of the African continent. And what you do today is also very central into how the supply chain evolves in the future. Because even when we're building green technology, we have to think about, does it replicate the same narrative? Or can we change the narrative and see the world differently? Many times I've talked to people and they say, well, changing is a bit too hard, it's too difficult. But what I say is that on the other hand, people have done very cruel things without asking for permission. So why are we always hesitating and saying, well, it's too difficult to live alternatively, or we cannot survive in a world outside of the dream of big tech? So thank you for listening. Thank you. Thank you.